Alright, what is up my homies, and welcome to Day 2 Brain Melt University. Today we're going to be going over building your own PC from scratch. Many people who work in the IT industry build their own computers. They do this because they enjoy computers, they do it because it's fun, and it gives them a lot of real-world experience, especially if they're still working their way through college or working their way through certifications but haven't yet found employment in the IT industry. Being able to describe your own experience building your personal computer is actually a great discussion topic for job interviews. I've been through several job interviews where one of the questions asked is, can you describe some of the projects that you've worked on? I especially saw this earlier in my career when I didn't yet have a lot of experience. Basically, they're trying to figure out what you do in your free time to determine whether you actually like this or whether you just went to school for it because someone made you. So if this is at all a topic that interests you, go ahead and sit back, relax, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with your friends if you haven't already. And let's get right into it. Alright, the first question that we have to ask is, why are you building your personal PC? I already talked about one, to get real-world experience if you don't yet have it, or just because you enjoy building computers, but there's also a few other considerations to make. Is this for professional use or for personal use, for recreation, for gaming, or for just watching videos? The answer to that question is going to determine whether very different types of components go into this computer system. As a general rule, professional systems such as server components or business graphics cards are designed for performing very specific tasks that recreational cards just don't do, and vice versa. I'll get into specifics between professional and gaming components as they arise, but do keep in mind that that is a question that you need to instantly have answered before you start ordering a single part. There might be some software you want to run that requires very specific types of components or very specific requirements that just aren't available by whatever is off the shelf. You might have a piece of software that just has a huge RAM requirement that is above anything that's off the shelf available, and you don't want to spend way more than you need to, you just want to spend a little more. And that brings us to our last topic, is this a cost-saving measure by building your own computer versus getting one from a factory? It used to actually be the case where it was cheaper to build your own computer from scratch than it was to buy one from the factory. But really, this no longer rings true. With the additional cost of consumer parts, plus the extreme demand for components like graphics cards due to things like cryptocurrency mining, and certain conflicts in Eastern Europe right now, I'm not going to say which ones, have all jacked up the price on consumer electronic components. And unless you're getting these bulk wholesale deals like, manufacturers are capable of getting, the price of individual components is not likely to be great. There are certain times of year that you can get pretty decent deals and build a computer that's basically on par with a factory one, but being able to build it yourself. And that's the main reason why I decided to build my own computer. I started finding decent deals about a month ago and started ordering parts piecemeal until I had everything I needed to put together my own computer. I didn't start building my own computer as a cost-saving measure. In fact, I could probably order the exact same computer from a company such as Origin PC for almost the exact same price, but I wanted to have the satisfaction of building my own. I've helped several people build their own computers over the years. My little brother, his wife's brother. Okay, I've helped 2 people build their own computer. But I've also worked in computer repair shops where I've had to fix and replace virtually every part in a computer a billion times over. So I have plenty of experience with it. It's something that I'm comfortable with, and I just wanted the satisfaction of finally having a computer that I built with my own 2 hands. So once we have the answers to those questions, we can actually start focusing on ordering parts. Now, the first thing that you need to have is the case. This is actually something that I did in reverse. The case was actually the last component that I ordered. Basically, I just ordered everything, figured out how big I needed, and then ordered the smallest case that would fit all of my components. In my case, I went with a Corsair 5000D. I'm not being sponsored by any of the companies whose components that I'm featuring in this video, so if a representative from any of those companies happens to be watching and wants to sponsor my videos, I would love it. I have like 20 viewers, tops. They're not watching. All right, so the Corsair 5000D is a mid-tower, and when you see these sizes, mid-tower, full-size, compact, these are not the same as the form factors that you're seeing with factory PCs, your full-size, your small form factor. These are much smaller in factory than they are for home builds. One of the reasons is that the vast majority of home builds are usually done because they're extremely high-performance systems. And so you really have to go out of your way to find towers or cases that are roughly on par with a factory-built PC. Instead, you're going to see a massive size difference. Your typical mid-sized tower is going to be twice as large as a full-size tower made by a computer company, and your full-size tower basically needs its own server room just to fit in. I went with a mid-sized tower because it was the smallest possible tower that would fit the graphics card that I chose, which is the largest component in your PC case. You do have to be careful about going with a case that's too small. Either you're going to end up with one that's so small that the case can no longer close once all the components are in it, and also you can reduce the amount of airflow, which if air can't freely move through your case, you're going to have issues with components overheating, and that can cause a lot of damage and additional sunk cost in repairs. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of your typical PC cases nowadays are just completely riddled and packed with LED. I intend to disable all the LED on my particular PC, mostly just because I don't need all that additional flash and flare. I'm looking for a computer that I can sit there and focus on the screen rather than the pretty lights on the side. Also, by turning off all the LED, I can slightly reduce the amount of power consumption, which this thing is going to be massive. So do keep in mind that if you are going to build with a full case, you're going to need a lot of desk real estate just to fit it. All right, now let's talk about the motherboard. So for my motherboard, I chose the Aorus Elite B550. Aorus is a Gigabyte subsidiary, so Gigabyte is one of the major gaming companies you see. Usually your major manufacturers for gaming boards are Gigabyte, Asus, and MSI. I've had really bad luck with Asus boards and with MSI boards. I've never had a single problem with the Aorus line of motherboards. Now, from what I've been told, I haven't done a significant amount of research in it, the Aorus boards are basically just a standard Gigabyte board with slightly fancier heat sinks and a lot of LED built in. Again, I don't need the LED, so why would I buy the Aorus board? Well, I've never had one fail. I've put dozens of Aorus boards in different computers, never had a single one fail. I've had 3 Asus boards in a row fail to be able to post. I've also seen 2 MSI boards that died before the rest of the components. Usually your motherboard is supposed to outlast any other component on the system. The main reason I went with Aorus boards is just because I've never had an issue, and so that's why I went with this one. Now, the B550 is an AM4 socket, so whatever CPU you intend to buy, you need to make sure that the motherboard supports that socket. Your motherboard is usually the first of the electronic components that you purchase and the first one that you install. But you want to make sure that you've made a decision on whether you want to go the Intel route as far as your processor or the AMD route. In this particular case, I decided to go AMD, and I'll get into my reasoning when I'm talking about CPUs. But that was my first component, is the motherboard. The next component we're going to talk about is the power supply. And I went with a 1050 watt power supply. Now, this is extremely important. Your power supply needs to minimally support all of the different components in your device. So your power supply should be the last component you order after you've calculated out the power consumption of all of your other parts. Because if your power supply doesn't support that, then you're not going to boot properly, or you're going to have different types of issues, usually display problems. Now, power supply is usually the second component you install into your case after you've put the motherboard in. It's the second largest component in your case, and it's usually easiest to install when you don't have other components getting in the way, like your RAM modules, your CPU, your heatsink, all that other fun stuff. So by putting your PSU in ahead of all that other stuff, you're going to just make your life a little easier moving forward. Now, with power supply units, you typically have a number of different ratings: bronze, silver, gold, platinum rated. Usually gold has been fine. I figured that was good enough quality, and I went with 1050 watt just because I'm going to be putting in a very nice graphics card. At least it's very nice as of the recording of this video. In 2 months, they'll probably come out with something that turns this thing into a dinosaur. dinosaur. But in the meantime, it's a very nice graphics card, but it has extremely high power consumption, so I went with 1050 watt. Now, just because you have a 1050 watt power supply in your PC does not mean that that's what it's actually going to consume. That just means that's the maximum it's rated to provide the rest of the components. So even though this is 1050, I'm probably going to be using like 700 to 800 watts at any given time. Another consideration is whether you're going with a modular or non-modular power supply. So most of your high-performance PSUs are going to be modular, meaning that they have a lot of sockets on the side and you connect a separate cable for every component that's going to require that specific pin style, but you don't have to connect every single cable on that power supply. Non-modular PSUs are usually your lower grade. Usually this is like your 350 watters, like your standard replacement power supplies for a regular factory PC. Your non-modulars just have a bunch of cables coming out the side, and if you have cables left over, you're stuck just trying to cable manage them into a rat's nest and push them out of the way so they don't inhibit airflow. So your modular PSUs are more designed to improve airflow by allowing you to not have more cables to provide power than is absolutely necessary. All right, the next component that we have to discuss is RAM. Now, RAM, random access memory, is the memory that's used while your computer is turned on. If your computer loses power, everything that's being stored in RAM is lost. But RAM is usually your way of storing information that's not necessarily needed this exact millisecond, but is going to be needed very soon in the future. RAM comes in many different flavors. The two current versions are DDR4, which is on its way out, and DDR5, which is on its way in. This is a very important distinction to make because every new version of RAM, whether it's DDR2, 3, 4, 5, is not backwards compatible. The modules do not fit in the previous style socket. So whatever motherboard you get, you need to verify what type of RAM it's designed for. In my particular case, the B550 board that I ordered is a DDR4 socket because DDR5 is still not completely standardized yet as far as RAM goes. It's been a thing in graphics cards for years now, but as far as random access memory, DDR5 is just starting to hit the market. And so I went with DDR4 RAM, and I went with 64 gigs of DDR4. So I bought two 32 gig kits. You can get these kits in either a 1 module card, 2 module cards, or 4 module cards. Most motherboards designed for gaming only have 4 RAM sockets total, so you want to make sure that the motherboard that you got supports the number of RAM modules that you're buying. So in this case, both of my 32 gig kits are 2 card kits, so I can utilize 2 pairs of 32 gigs each. You want to make sure that your RAM is matched. All of your RAM modules need to operate at the same speed. They need to have the same latency requirements, and you can mix and match these, like mixing a 4 gig module with an 8 gig module, but it's not really recommended. Usually, just to be safe, I even try and match manufacturers because just because a SK Hynix and a Corsair card have the same performance on paper, your Corsair is probably going to be a higher quality and probably going to do its job just a little better, which over time, that lower quality SK Hynix is probably just not going to match. Now, that isn't a batch on SK Hynix. It's an extremely popular RAM manufacturer, especially with factory PCs, so that's not a dish on it. I've never actually seen an SK Hynix card go bad. There's just a difference in manufacturing quality between your higher end gaming companies and these lower end economy brands. So that's one of the reasons why I went with 2 identically matched Corsair LPX Vengeance kits, just because I didn't want to have any of that possibility of slightly mismatched cards. Another type of memory that you have to worry about is non-volatile memory, which is memory that doesn't get deleted as soon as your device loses power, which is why you need to focus on finding some sort of storage medium. You have 2 options. You can go with a traditional mechanical hard disk drive, HDD, or you can go with the newer standard solid state drives, which are just a chipset that stores your data. In this case, for my particular build, I went with 2 Samsung 970 EVO Pluses, 2 terabytes each. These are solid state drives that are designed to fit into M2 sockets. These are very compact storage drives with very fast buses, and your bus on your motherboard, if you don't know, is the connection style or connection type that's going to pass data. The wider your bus, the more information you can move to and from that storage media at a time. I went with M2 drives because these are, at this point in history, considered to be the fastest storage media possible. Solid state drives are much faster than mechanical drives because it's just a simple lookup to find data versus a hard disk drive where you actually have a read-write arm and that disk has to pass a specific point in order for that arm to collect whether that's a 0 or a 1 stored on the disk. So hard disk drives are much slower, and because they have mechanical moving parts, they tend to fail at a faster rate. Now this is true for personal computers, not for data centers. In data centers, because SSDs have a limited number of times that a particular section of a chip can be overwritten, data centers tend to see much higher failure rates for solid disk drives than traditional home use. For home users, an SSD is probably going to outlast the computer versus a hard disk drive, which usually needs to be replaced every 3 to 5 years on average, in my personal experience. The reason I went with two 2 terabytes is a couple reasons. One, they don't make 4 or 8 terabyte M2 drives yet. And 2, because I currently am using a 2 terabyte SATA solid state drive in my existing computer, which I'm using to record this video on because I haven't put it together yet. And because I'm using that 2 terabyte for all of my game storage and all of my video editing, I'm running out of capacity. Like, I'm to the point where I have to delete a game before I can download a new one, and I'm really tired of doing that shuffling. So the idea is that all of my games will go on one of these solid state drives, and my operating system and files are all going to be stored on the other drive. So then that way there's 2 different devices that are not going to be competing for storage resources, and also I'll get faster performance because my operating system and my games are using 2 separate buses. I had played around with the idea of doing what's called a striped drive, which is where I have one volume that spans both of these disks. But if either of these disks ever fails for any reason whatsoever, then the other one becomes completely unusable. By keeping these separate, I don't have the ability to overlap drives. So if one of these drives gets completely full, I just have to start deleting stuff out of it, versus the striped drive that could move between both drives. If my game drive fails, my operating system is still perfectly fine, and if my operating system drive fails, my games are all still there, so I'm not stuck having to spend hours or days re-downloading all of them. These are considerations that you really want to make when you're building your own PC. Next up, we get to talk about CPUs. CPUs are arguably the most important component that you can put in your PC build. In this particular case, I went all out and I went with an AMD Ryzen 9 5950X, which is the highest quality Ryzen CPU that AMD makes. This brings up a good topic, which is AMD or Intel, which is better? Well, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you absolutely unequivocally Intel is the better company. Up until about 5 years ago, AMD was always kind of considered that budget brand, the economy brand, the one that you put in when you can't afford Intel. And even their higher quality CPUs were in no way competitive with Intel. It wasn't until AMD released the Ryzen line about 5 years ago that they really became a competitor. And they actually, for a short time, had a superior product to Intel. Because if I remember correctly, the Ryzen 9 actually predated the Intel i9 processor. Up to that point, Intel only had the i3, i5, and i7. Now they have i3, 5, 7, and 9. So they kind of matched AMD's naming schema. When it comes to which of these two lines you're going to use, whether it's the Intel i series or the AMD Ryzen series, it's kind of a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other type of comparison. There are slight advantages of Intel CPUs in particular use cases, and there are slight advantages of AMD in other use cases. And because I intend to use this PC for both of those cases, there's no point in me prioritizing an Intel or an AMD, so I decided to just go with AMD and get the cheaper motherboard and the cheaper CPU to go with it. This ended up saving me about $150 between the motherboard and the CPU. And while yes, there's going to be some instances where I'm not going to get quite that performance, but I mean, honestly, this is a absolute top tier CPU. I'm probably never going to hit 100% CPU utilization unless either something is broke or I'm doing something wrong. Now, you do want to make sure, based off of those prerequisite questions you asked, Am I going for recreation or am I going for professional? If this is going to be a server, I wouldn't use either an AMD Ryzen or an Intel i9. Instead, I would probably go with an Intel Xeon processor. Xeon processors are processors designed for servers. Xeon processors tend to handle a lot more tasks a lot more quickly, but these tend to be more basic tasks in nature, versus your recreational CPUs, which might have fewer processes to have to run, but they're going to be larger processes to deal with. Meanwhile, if you're trying to play Assassin's Creed Valhalla using a Xeon card, you're probably going to start seeing smoke coming out of your case pretty shortly. That brings us to another good question. How am I going to cool my CPU? Between your CPU and your graphics card, cooling is an extremely major concern for your system. And you have two main options. You can have a liquid cooled, which is a newer method of cooling your system, or you can have an air cooled. These kind of follow the same principles as aircraft and automobiles. The liquid cooled is extremely similar to the radiator found in automobiles. It's a component filled with some sort of heat conducting liquid that is constantly being pumped back and forth between a cooling system, a radiator, and the CPU. So you have this system where you need a water pump, you have liquid moving inside your system, and you still need fans to cool all of this down, just like the fan on your motor. Liquid-cooled systems tend to be higher consumption because there's a water pump in addition to the fans necessary to do the cooling, and there is also that slight chance that radiators will leak. And if you do that, you have liquid in the same place as electronic components. Not a good mixture. I've never personally seen anyone whose radiators have ever leaked, but I have read stories about people whose radiators leaked and basically forced them to get a whole new system. It's that level of risk I've never been able to accept, and Linus Tech Tips a few years back did a comparison and actually found that there were still some air-cooled systems that outperformed even the best radiators on the market. So it's for that reason that I, to this day, continue to use just a simple air-cooled CPU. Again, this is a fancy LED fan setup, so I intend to disable all the LED on it. It's absolutely not necessary for my purposes, but you do want to make sure that you're going with a high-quality CPU fan cooler. I typically go with Cooler Master. I've always preferred Cooler Master. They are not the cheapest anymore, but for a long time they were actually the most economical, but they're also very good at what they do. They're all very good at dissipating that heat, drawing it away from the CPU, and blowing it back out. Your PC case is also going to have fans. They need to have a way to get cool air in and blow hot air back out. So you want to make sure that whichever direction your PC fans are facing, that your CPU cooler fan is not blowing against them, because then you just have two opposing forces and that air gets trapped and you end up with cooling problems. So do make sure that you're paying attention to the orientation of your CPU fans and making sure that they are not interfering with the PC cooling fans. That's also a good thing to bring up, is that your typical PC case does come with a few fans installed, but unless you're buying like the super duper cases manufactured by Cooler Master, you're usually not going to have all of the fan slots occupied. Like usually there's just a one fan in, one fan out. So if you really need a lot of cooling, a lot of airflow, you're probably going to be stuck buying additional fans. These aren't expensive. They're like $5 to $10 tops for just a decent case fan, unless you're looking for fancy LED. That is something worth mentioning, that the case that I bought only comes with 2 fans. I do intend to try it out using just those 2 fans in addition to my CPU cooler fan, but if that proves to be inadequate, I'm going to be stuck ordering additional fans. Okay, here's the deal. After recording the original video, I actually started putting my computer apart, and no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. That old military adage seems true here. My Cooler Master CPU cooler that I had originally selected doesn't fit. Now, it fits the case, it fits the motherboard. However, I cannot install my graphics card with that particular CPU installed. That particular CPU happens to have some overlap with the first PCIe 16 slot on the motherboard, and if I try and move my graphics card a little bit further over, now I have some cable management issues where the cables can actually get bound up in the fans, and I really don't want to risk a $1,400 graphics card for a bit of laziness. So I've decided to do a little bit of backtracking. So my Cooler Master CPU cooler isn't going to work. I tried looking at the next size down of Cooler Master cooler, but it's only 1 centimeter thinner as far as width goes, and I really don't feel comfortable with that margin of error either. So I've done a complete rethink on what I'm going to be using, and so instead I've gone with just this simple AMD Stealth Wraith CPU cooler. Now, this isn't a gaming grade heatsink. This is designed for your lower grade Ryzen 5s, maybe a Ryzen 7 if you're really pushing it. So I'm not going to be doing a whole lot with this. So in the meantime, while I'm exploring more heat options, this was only $10, so it at least gets me up and running. And I'm still going to have probably superior performance to my old computer that I'm recording this video on. So unfortunately, I might have to explore options for a water-cooled system. Yeah. Anyway, back to the rest of the movie. And finally, we come to our last component, and that is the graphics card, the part we've all been waiting for. So in my particular case, I went with a Gigabyte graphics card. Now, I've never bought Gigabyte graphics cards before. I tend to prefer EVGA cards, but thanks to good old Bitcoin mining, EVGA cards are awfully expensive these days. So I pretty much bought the first graphics card from a reputable company that hit my price point. I was trying to hold out for a GeForce RTX 3090 chipset, but I couldn't pass up a 3080 Ti, so it's the next step down from the 3090. It's still superior to even the highest end AMD card, which is the AMD 6900 XT. And the 6900 XT, while I was doing my shopping, was more expensive than the 3080 Ti. So I'm starting to get a little upset with the size of the drivers that NVIDIA is releasing for their graphics cards. And also I'm starting to get a little grumpy about the fact that the last 2 NVIDIA graphics cards that I've had have had a 5-year service life. Up to that point, I've never had a graphics card not outlive the rest of the component. Usually you're seeing failures of all the other components before the graphics card does, and if it is the graphics card, usually it's the fans that go bad. But in my particular case, the last 2 cards that I've had, which was the NVIDIA GTX 980 and the current computer that you see me recording on, which is already going bad, the 1080 Ti. Both of these have had about a 5-year service life, and this is on its last legs. I can't play any game that's been released in the last 5 years without getting blue screens of death and extreme overheating issues. And yes, I've tried changing the thermal paste. So just for my particular build, I went with that, but if you're getting any of those 3 cards that I mentioned, whether it's the AMD Radeon 6900 XT, the NVIDIA 3080 Ti, or the 3090, all of these are amazing cards by current standards as of recording of this video. They'll play anything on the market, maybe not at maximum settings unless you have the 3090, but they'll play anything released up to this point with absolutely no problems whatsoever, or at least they damn well better. This does bring up a good question. Is this a professional card or is this a gaming card? Now, there are 2 very different types of graphics cards. There are the graphics cards that are designed for 3D modeling, and there are the graphics cards designed for lots of streaming video very quickly. And the major difference of this is that your 3D modeling cards, your professional grade cards, are designed for making very complex calculations, but not necessarily a constantly updating, needing it done every single millisecond. Your gaming cards are designed for doing as many calculations as possible to render as many images as quickly as possible. When we're gaming, the almighty frame rate is usually a major concern. And if you're using a professional grade graphics card, such as the NVIDIA Quadro cards, these are not designed for gaming. They are designed for making absolutely gorgeous 3D models. These are designed for CNC machining, for 3D printing. All that stuff is done using professional cards, not gaming cards. And likewise, if you're trying to throw the highest end GTX 3090 into a system that you're trying to do 3D modeling on, it's going to struggle. I actually had someone who went out and bought just the most expensive graphics card that they could, threw it in their system, and couldn't figure out why they still couldn't run AutoCAD or whatever imaging software they were using. I had to be the one to tell them, listen, you bought a gaming card. You need a professional card. That's an extremely important distinction to make. There is a difference between gaming quality, professional quality, and server quality. 3 different grades of equipment, and all 3 have very specific use cases. And so that's my PC build. I didn't bother mentioning all of the peripherals. I might do that in a later video just to describe what I bought, why I bought it, and how it's working out for me. I also didn't mention operating system, so there's probably going to be a 3rd video in this series. The next video is going to be the actual assembly of the PC tower. And then the 3rd video is probably going to be going over the peripherals, installing the operating system, and setting it up the way that I want. So prepare for those videos. They are going to be shot on a GoPro, so the sound quality is probably not going to be as high as it is with this particular setup. And once again, my studio layout is probably going to change yet again for the massive tower that's going to be taking the place of what's currently a laptop. All of these are great things that I plan for the future. Hopefully we'll get to them very soon and very quickly. Stay safe, and I'll see you all here next time at BrainMelt University.